All right, let's cover a few more questions before our mass break. So now we're into related issue 3. And within related issue 3, you're going to see terms like outsourcing. And not only will you need to know what the term means, but you'll need to understand some of the reasons why a transnational corporation may choose to outsource to countries like India. What advantage might a country like India present to a transnational? But we also want you to look at the topic of outsourcing from both the perspective of, say, a host country like India and from the perspective of North American workers. So we might ask you a question like, if the source was rewritten to reflect a North American worker's perspective, what would be the central issue presented? So we want you to be able to think creatively and critically and be able to see how outsourcing affects North American workers. Other stuff from Chapter 9 will include not only a reference to the Bretton Woods Conference, but there will also be a flowchart looking at the major events at the beginning of Chapter 9, like World War I and the Great Depression and World War II, that help lead up to the Bretton Woods Conference. Speaking of Bretton Woods, you also need to be able to understand the purposes of the IMF and World Bank, and other either agreements or organizations that kind of come out of economic globalization include NAFTA and the EU. So going back and understanding the purposes of these will be helpful, along with the WTO and GATT. So IMF, World Bank, NAFTA, EU, WTO, GATT, all have their place on this exam. Speaking of NAFTA and the EU, we're going to have questions 30 to 33 that will have cartoons that look at the EU and look at NAFTA, and you'll have to look at the cartoon and try to find ideological perspectives. You know, are they presenting a problem? Are they celebrating some kind of solution? What is the purpose of the cartoon? One way to phrase that might be a question like, which of the following issues best captures the message embedded within the source? So they'll give you 4 possible issues. You know, should we do this or should we do that? And you need to look at the nuances, the details within the source and say, which of these issues is actually being addressed by the source? We'll also ask you questions like, what's the most likely outcome if an idea is put into place? So there'll be ideas about trade liberalization, removing of trade barriers, and then therefore we need to know, if you get rid of that, what it would be a likely consequence. Other related terms will be things like cartels and, again, transnationals. You might see the term Crown Corporation, which is a government-owned corporation. And that's that section. Next section, we have more information about the WTO, and we also have a little connection with the UN. So look in the textbook for the little section on the UN. Living in a time of a pandemic, you shouldn't be completely confused as to what the World Health Organization does. So who will be on the test, along with the WTO. But we'll also see a reference to Amnesty International, which is an organization that is trying to free political prisoners. But it's not as simple as just memorizing things. We want you to look at a cartoon and say, the cartoonist is most likely, are they an opponent, are they a supporter, and of what? Moving on, questions 39, 40, 41. Again, go back to outsourcing. So much like a simulation's all over the test, so is outsourcing. There's a cartoon that we looked at in class about the buildings leaving New York, going to China and India. There's a photograph looking at sweatshop conditions in a garment factory in Thailand. And then there's a quote about outsourcing and about sweatshops. So we want you to be able to put these 3 sources together and find the central message. Finding a central message is the same activity as the relationship part in the A1. So you've had lots of exposure to that. Looking for language here that could be confusing. Again, multinational corporation is much like transnational, does business in many countries. Not really too many vocabulary words here that should be a challenge at this point of the course. Outsourced products are products that come from, outsourcing countries. Little things like that pop up. Then we get into some questions about world oil and peak oil. And then there's a long quote about gross national happiness. So go back in the textbook and read over the G&H part of, I believe it's chapter 11. Could be the beginning of chapter 10. But go over the gross national happiness coming from Bhutan and go back and review that. There's a cartoon looking at Alberta oil sands, so I have to break down the cartoon and see, based on the details within the cartoon, are they celebrating the oil sands or are they being critical of them? And then to finish off this segment, and then we will have our mask break and we'll look at the third of the 3 segments after lunch. Finish off this segment, there will be some sources about water privatization like we saw in Cucamonga, Bolivia. And we want you to be able to look at the sources. Again, find out the perspective they're coming from or what kind of principle that they're being addressed on. In order to do well, you might want to know for the next set the word corporate ladder and how women have traditionally had more difficulty raising the corporate ladder because of gender bias. And there's a non-social studies term here as well, which is irony. So irony is when the unexpected ends up happening. So I was always taught that it's like having an Olympic swimmer that drowns in a bathtub. That's kind of ironic, because you wouldn't expect someone that much skill of swimming end up dying in those circumstances. Because bathtub, very little water kind of stuff, right? All right, so that's the first 50 of 60 questions. We'll look at the last 10 after the break, after lunch that is. So go give yourselves a mask break. You should be back here by 10:30, and then you should study until 10:55.